So a few days ago, something really cool happened. For context, I put out a video a couple months ago detailing some Dragon Ball games that never came to fruition, with an interview from Paul Ryan, Senior Vice President of Infogrames and GamePro magazine, as my main source. This video did very well, being my most viewed video on my channel, but also seemed to have attracted some attention, some good attention. A few days ago, Gerry Swanson, a former developer at Webfoot Games with credits on most of the Dragon Ball games coming out of Webfoot, including the Legacy of Goku 1 and 2, Boost Fury, and Taiketsu, left some great comments on a few of my videos, adding some greater context to those topics. Gerry had already provided some cool information to YouTuber Matt McMuscles about this stuff, but while Matt's video was focused mainly around Taiketsu, I had already referenced Matt's video on my own as the impetus for some of the further research I did. And so I was excited to see Gerry actually drop some new knowledge about some of the projects that were worked on at Webfoot. The biggest thing that Gerry mentions is that a lot of the crazy potential Dragon Ball games that Paul Ryan mentions in his interview were never actually in formal development, and that there's the very real possibility that Paul was just making stuff up on the fly. To my knowledge, nothing he's describing there relates to any project that was ever in development. I honestly think he might have been just making things up off the top of his head. As shocking as this is, especially coming from an official source in an official publication, this didn't surprise me. Paul Ryan wasn't exactly a ground level employee. As Senior Vice President, he was very much a spokesperson, with the goal of stirring excitement and hype around the IPs that the company held licenses for. And that might mean stretching truths a little bit, especially after bagging Dragon Ball Z, probably one of the hottest properties in America circa 2003. Now, to get a little bit of context for Gerry's comments, we have to dive into a bit of semantics around game development, because words do have meaning. Saying a game was in development implies that the game is being worked on with the intention of being released at some point. So excluding projects such as tech demos and proposal designs. And so for a game to have been canceled, it theoretically would have needed to be in development, or at the very least have been planned for development and eventual release. And of the 3 projects that Gerry talks about in his comments, only one of these were actually technically in development. The first project that Gerry talks about is a small tech demo worked on around the same time as the first Legacy of Goku game. At the same time Legacy of Goku was being developed, there was a 3D Dragon Ball Z game being worked on. However, what that game was very ill-defined. I'm not even sure it had a design document. We were just making models and levels for some sort of action-adventure game. Like many tech demonstrations, this was to show that Webfoot Games theoretically had the capabilities to deliver a console game experience with their Dragon Ball Z license. Gerry mentions that the photos in the GamePro article came from this tech demonstration, and all of this aligns a lot with what was shown at the E3 2001 Infogrames presentation, which is where I assume the tech demo was initially shown off. Gerry then goes on to drop information about the game referred to by the team as Saiyan Smash, which apparently started actual formal development around the same time that the Game Boy Advance game Taiketsu was being worked on and the Legacy of Goku 2. Eventually those assets were taken and we began developing a game that was being referred to as Saiyan Smash. There was a prototype at one point where characters were running around in a level and 4 players can fight each other. Gerry says that the game was definitely inspired by Power Stone, which the developers played a lot of on the Sega Dreamcast in their office. Power Stone is generally considered a 3D arena fighter in the same way that Super Smash Bros. Is like a 2D platform fighter. I wouldn't exactly say it invented the formula. There were games like Air Guys that followed a similar game style earlier, but it undoubtedly inspired a lot of clones during the PlayStation 2 and GameCube era of gaming. Off the top of my head, I can already think of games like Shrek Super Slam, that Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy game, Teen Titans had one, One Piece had one, and it seemed like Dragon Ball Z was next on the list. The game was initially targeted for all three consoles, PlayStation 2, GameCube, and Xbox. However, Sony would go on to force some major requirements on them. Sony said that not enough people were buying the multi-tap peripheral that made 4-player games possible on the PS2. At the time, Sony had a lot of clout and they were dictating not only what had to be in the PS2 version of the game, but also what couldn't be in the GameCube and Xbox versions of the game. Since they wouldn't let us make a 4-player game on the PS2, we were told that the GameCube and Xbox versions could not have 4 players either. So Atari ended up canceling the game altogether. And so yeah, I imagine a scenario where the GameCube had the unique feature of being able to support more players than the PlayStation 2 in a major licensed game would not look favorable on Sony's part. Gerry also mentions that the troubles with getting this game off the ground seem to have played a major role in Infogrames or Atari bringing the game series Dragon Ball Z Budokai over to North American audience, so that is something good that came out of this, I guess. In terms of Dragon Ball Z Sagas, Dragon Ball Z Sagas would end up being the first American-made home console game released in the United States, developed by Avalanche Studios. Gerry reveals, however, that Webfoot Games actually pitched an initial proposal. After Saiyan Smash, we started talking about what eventually became Dragon Ball Z Sagas. Sagas was originally inspired by Devil May Cry and arcade beat-em-ups. However, after writing up a proposal for the game, it was given to the other developer, and as far as I know, none of the Webfoot assets were actually used in the game. After that, I thought that was going to be the end of Gerry's input, but he also kindly provided some extra tidbits to my Boost Fury video, where I highlighted some cut and change content from the earlier prototypes of said game. He goes on to reveal the reason for the game's name change, which dropped the Legacy of Goku from its title. This name change was apparently an attempt to separate themselves from the failure that was the Legacy of Goku 1. Atari decided that the bad reviews from the first game were affecting sales, so they decided to change the name. No one on the team liked that idea, but we didn't really have a choice. Despite the Legacy of Goku 2 being a great game, it didn't sell as well as the first Legacy of Goku game, which actually is one of the best-selling games on the Game Boy Advance system, believe it or not. In my video, I also brought up Androids 13, 14, and 15, whose files are present in the prototypes of the game, but seem to have been removed from the final version. According to Gerry, the developers wanted them to be in the game, but they were waiting on approval from the higher ups to actually get permission to include them. I actually worked overtime to finish the ice area at the very last minute. However, despite my efforts, the game was declared feature complete before it was able to be included, and all that stuff was unfortunately scrapped. This is actually really cool to me because it implies that the ice area made it further to completion than even what we saw in the prototype. Some fans were even able to extract prototypes of the cut Android boss fights in later versions of the prototypes, so I'm sure some remnants of Gerry's final version exist somewhere. In terms of the portrait sketches that I found on Webfoot's internal development website, Gerry mentions that they were created by an actual artist who worked on the anime. I believe the portraits were created by an artist who worked for Toei or Shueisha, an actual artist who worked on the anime. I do not know who the actual artist was, but the artist at Webfoot took those drawings and turned them into pixelated portraits for the game. Finally, I was able to directly ask him about Dragon Ball Z Taiketsu, specifically to figure out what GameCube game it was initially meant to connect to. Gerry says he doesn't think development on the Link connection got far enough to actually tie to a specific in-development game. Unlike most of the Dragon Ball games that Webfoot worked on, Taiketsu was worked on by a team in another state for a while the main Webfoot office was working on other stuff. I don't remember any serious work being put into the GameCube GBA connection thing. It always struck me as something that Atari wanted to push. While no secret by any means, he also took some time to talk about some of the absolutely tumultuous development cycle of the game. By the time I started working on the game, there were a lot of things about it that I felt needed to be fixed, but it was kind of too late. I didn't like the graphics, I didn't think it played very well. They were asking, what can we do to fix this? And it was like, without starting over, you mean? To make things worse, The Webfoot offices had an electrical fire and the whole place burned down while we were working on the Taiketsu. For real, I showed up to work one day and everyone was standing across the street and there were fire trucks everywhere. We stood there and watched the whole place burn down, and then we had to work from home. Once it was all over and we got a new office, we started calling Taiketsu that which shall not be named. All in all, getting this information straight from the source was amazing, and I'm glad Gerry was able to randomly pop by and put in his input. Webfoot Games is a bit of a punching bag nowadays, with games such as Taiketsu and the Legacy of Goku lingering over their head. Yet, I think the Legacy of Goku 2 and Boost Fury are some of the biggest labors of love I've seen from the franchise, including some of the Japanese produced games. And I've got to say, as a PlayStation 2 kid, I definitely would have been excited for Saiyan Smash had it actually been released. Either way, I hope we start to get more insights like this from other developers in the future, as it really puts into perspective the work that goes into the games that we get. Anyway, if you're interested in seeing more Dragon Ball related gaming content and videos, please subscribe. It goes a long way towards helping me put out more videos regularly. Alright,